On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Kelsey Steinbeck. She is the Director of Software Engineering DevOps at Indigo. We're going to be talking about processes and staying nimble, staying agile. And we're going to be going through some of the areas that, Kelsey's seen, the evaluation areas of opportunity where you should or should not, make those decisions. It's more art than science. So I think the more perspectives we get, the better on this topic. Kelsey, thanks for being on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Let's start off at the top and know two things. One, what Indigo does, and then what are some of the responsibilities that you have?
Sure. So Indigo really is creating software and tools to help farmers sustainably feed the planet. We use technology to drive sustainability and profitability in agriculture. And we are focused on kind of enhancing some soil health and avenues that maybe haven't been explored as much in the agriculture space.
Awesome. And what are some of the responsibilities that you have in your role?
So DevOps at Indigo really does everything but actual application development. So, we think of Indigo as having many little startups within kind of the overall startup. And DevOps is kind of at that central control of steering the ship and trying to keep, putting just enough process in place so we don't have chaos, so we can kind of keep it managed chaos. So we support all of the application teams and all of kind of these little startup pods, and support everybody to kind of deploy and build and deploy software in the best ways that we can.
So a couple of interesting things we can kind of dive in there and talk about the context of, adding processes, staying nimble. Those are not always things that go hand in hand, but just for everyone to understand and the context, you mentioned you guys, provide just enough process. What stage of DevOps maturity is the org at?
I think we're actually in a relatively mature phase for DevOps. When I started, I was the second engineering hire, and then really kind of helped build out our engineering ecosystem. And there were some things that were really, really important to me in that. And a couple of those were automated deployment builds and deployments. You don't make manual changes into production. Infrastructure as code. And now we're really kind of on the journey of allowing developers to really be self-sufficient, creating enough documentation and patterns and things for them to unblock themselves while still following some of, DevOps key principles. And, I think we have improvements we can make in the deployment times and cycle times and things like that. But for the most part, at least those key practices are in place. And I think of DevOps as just kind of a continuous improvement mechanism. And so we're always continuously improving, but those core principles are in place.
Absolutely. And you mentioned, obviously, it's a bigger company, but you mentioned it kind of works like a bunch of smaller startups. Maybe if you could just, maybe explain what that is.
Yeah, so we have a marketplace that's kind of a separate product offering than, let's just say, our sustainability product offering. Both very separate entities, but both still have corresponding attributes that kind of bring it into one kind of holistic platform that Indigo offers, but two different product offerings.
Okay, interesting. So you mentioned obviously putting just enough structure in place to kind of have some controlled chaos. I guess when you're looking at the addition of processes and you're trying to evaluate when to make adjustments, are there any things any signs you look for, or any things that you're keeping track of that kind of give you a feeling that it's something to take a look at as a team or as an individual?
Yep. I'm going to separate out two different kinds of process. So I'm not talking about process within your software development lifecycle that are best practices. So I'm not talking about testing before you go to production, or making sure you have a code reviewer those types of things are just engineering best practices, and we're not arguing about the value of those. We already understand the velocity cost with having some of those pre-deployment checks, and there's a lot of benefit to that I'm not going to go into. I'm really talking about other business requirements that require potentially a process hit in your SDLC. So I want to make sure I separate those two things. I very much view your SDLC as this kind of living ecosystem. And I think it's really our job as engineering leaders to protect that ecosystem. And any process, regardless if it's an engineering best practice or a process that the business might want to introduce into the SDLC, will require a velocity hit. So outside of engineering best practices, any process that someone wants to implement into the SDLC, I'm really process adverse. So I kind of start with the mindset of, no, we don't introduce any process. And then really dig into, one, what is the requirement of that process and why? So that's one big piece of it. A lot of times what you'll find out is somebody on the business might have a requirement to do something in your SDLC for reasons, but when you really dig into what that requirement is, it might not actually be a requirement, or it might be too nebulous, or they might want to save $10,000 for for like an insurance provider for reasons. They might get a savings. That few $1,000s of savings is not going to be savings over time by the time you add up all of the velocity hits that happened within your SDLC. So it's really understanding the requirement. Will that requirement stand the test of time? Meaning, let's say some VP in some business unit wants to introduce some sort of attribute into the SDLC. If that individual leaves, is that requirement does it stand on its 2 feet still? So then once you have a really defined requirement, the implementation of that requirement is also really important. And you should always be reviewing like your implementation of that requirement, because it's going to create some new process in your SDLC with the customers of your SDLC. And in my mind, the customers of your SDLC are developers. So what are you going to be asking developers to do? Is there a way that you can abstract that from a developer even knowing it's a requirement in your SDLC? So those are the two kinds of things I think about when somebody wants to do something in the engineering ecosystem, is really understanding the clear requirement and then the implementation, because how I would choose to implement a requirement might be very different from, say, somebody in IT who might implement that requirement. And you need to review those implementations with your customers.
That's awesome. I think a lot of that is great insight. And you mentioned something I was going to go back to. Business might, and I definitely agree. There's two different types of processes, and we're probably not talking about engineering best practices. Not the right topic for the podcast. But when we're looking at the business-driven potential changes, and in the example we provide, maybe it's a short-term saving. Somebody sees that, somebody's like, "Hey, this is an opportunity as a business we want to take advantage of." Comes to you, obviously you're going to do your due diligence. You mentioned evaluation of that, and when the process doesn't fit the team, what happens then? Like, obviously you're going back to the business, but typically what happens when that has to happen for you?
When that process doesn't make sense.
Doesn't make sense.
Yeah. And that's hard, because when I started out earlier in my career, I didn't feel empowered to like really push back on that. So in a lot of cases, I just did the thing. Like, I just kind of took this nebulous requirement, even though I didn't fully understand it, might implement it. And then even if you get rid of that implementation later, it's so expensive. That tech debt occurred because you implemented something that wasn't necessarily needed, is now a huge cost to rip out of that SDLC. So now I really if I don't agree with a requirement, I really take it up the chain. Luckily, I work at Indigo, and Indigo has really great leadership. And if somebody's trying to do something into the SDLC that you don't agree with, I can signal that up, and they will ask the questions. We might have to implement it. I'm not saying I get my way all the time, and I'm not always right. And we might have to do something in the SDLC for reasons, but at least it's escalated up to senior leadership because it's their job. They know, they've been around the block, that there's going to be a hit to their velocity. And so they're just as protective as I am.
Absolutely. I guess, as you're going through this, I'm sure, there's plenty of requests that come in. Some can be done, some cannot be done. You have a team. When you are working with the team, maybe somebody on the team gets approached. How do you collaborate with the team? Obviously, you're the manager, you're the director, but how's that relationship work when outside requirements come in? Maybe not through you initially. How does that work through the process? Is it pretty much the same?
Yeah, they escalated up to me, and we've had to get a lot better at that. Really. Because what that does is it puts you in really reactive mode all the time. When somebody comes in and needs you to do a thing or needs a thing done, we're really shifting to being proactive and trying to anticipate business needs. But I have a lot of trust in my developers. I think they've got really great instincts, especially in DevOps. They have such a breadth. They know most of the ecosystem, so they can understand the implications of said process that's coming in. Not all development teams have that breadth, but that's what I think a specialty of DevOps, and why DevOps is really valuable, is that we understand almost the whole SDLC ecosystem. And so if a developer gets approached by somebody in the business that, hey, we need to do this thing, they'll immediately escalate it up. And a lot of times I have the conversations with the DevOps engineers like, hey, we're being asked to do this thing. What do you think about it? And a lot of times they'll push back hard. And that's really a signal to me. If DevOps engineers are pushing back hard on a thing, it's my responsibility to push hard upstream. Again, we might not get our way, but they are the subject matter experts in the SDLC, and you have to listen to those signals from them. You can't just implement a process because somebody says to do so. It really has to be vetted, because any process will add additional velocity cost. And your SDLC is kind of a culture. Like, you operate in it every single day. Developers can choose to go work somewhere else because they have better process. So there's a lot of nuanced things around your SDLC, and it's why you need to be really protective of it. So it's our job to listen to those signals.
I like that. You mentioned velocity hit. I just wanted to just make sure when you're mentioning velocity, what metric are you speaking about?
It could be any metric.
Okay.
So at a previous company, for example, we had to submit a ticket to do absolutely everything as an engineer. I remember adding that up because for the business, it's less than a 5-minute process. That statement sounds so easy. Yeah, it's less than 5 minutes. It's not that big a deal. It's fine. Well, take that 5 minutes, times it by 10 times a week, by 4 weeks a month, by 12 months a year, times 500 engineers. That's thousands of hours of engineering time being spent on submitting tickets. So it's not just cycle times. It's not just your cycle time of deploying to production. It's your context switching out of, it's already hard enough to focus as an engineer. You're having to context switch out of that into something else. Context switching back in, that's not actually 5 minutes. That might be a 15-minute context switch. So there's all sorts of metrics. When I talk about velocity hit, it's not just, measurable cycle times. There's lots of velocity hits that are really, really hard to measure, but everybody knows they exist. you might get nerd sniped on this process that you don't, somebody might ask, hey, why do we even have this process in place? Then you have to spend 20 minutes to go dig into, I don't even know why we have this in place. So there are all sorts of metrics in your SDLC. Some are measurable and some aren't. And when I talk about process, if you introduce it into your SDLC, it will have a velocity hit somewhere. And you need to understand where in your SDLC that will have a velocity hit.
Interesting. A velocity hit, I think you've definitely, you've very, very well articulated kind of the implications to that. And, obviously, I like the stance of, you mentioned start with a no mindset and then dig in, prove value to the business process chain, talk to the business about it. In the cases of when you're looking at that and you're evaluating, the velocity hit's worth it. You're going to go ahead and implement something, potentially it's going to slow people down. You're looking at that whole org and you're starting to count those hours. You mentioned, obviously, an engineer can come back, the culture. When people come back, down the road and they don't remember why you did this and you have to kind of carry some of that legacy, that cultural knowledge with you. How do you get over that to make sure that you reduce some of that, friction of, well, this just doesn't make sense? Because if everyone's thinking that and everyone's explaining it to a new hire, that does take a lot of time and people might not explain it as cleanly as when it was done. People might go, well, it's something we have to do and it kind of sucks. And all of a sudden that person's like, yeah, we kind of have to do it and it sucks. And that kind of ricochets all the way through the org.
And this is something I'm still learning. Engineering is very much a journey. But one thing I really learned about this is document the reason why and have it visible somewhere. Be able to show chats, be able to show meeting notes why you had it. You can point folks to the requirements, and then they can kind of review that context. Best case scenario, a developer will come and say, I read that requirement and here's a much better implementation for this thing. I think I'm in DevOps. I love automating all of the things. So all of the requirements or process that we can automate and abstract out, the better. We might spend more time having to develop the automation for that process and make it really lightweight for an engineer to follow. But in the long run, it's worth it. So if you do have to implement process, try to find ways to abstract it. I use an example of change management. One implementation of change management is a CAB board, very heavy-handed. Another implementation of change management is, being able to audit your GitHub pull request. They're the same things. You're solving the same requirements. One is heavy-handed and not automated. One is mostly automated. So there are ways to introduce your process in really thoughtful ways that will not have as big of a velocity hit as something like a CAB board.
Interesting. Very good point. And I think, I like how you mentioned, that's something that, being intentional with these changes, just because somebody's asking you to do it, being reactionary versus, planning and having that intent. And I like the documentation, the show chats, the meeting notes, because I think when you mentioned the SDLC as a culture, and you can have this culture people join, and when you look back years later, and you're like, well, it's not quite what I signed. It wasn't the same job when I first joined. And you look at all the little changes, and it becomes this fragmented process, and all of a sudden, there's just the developer experience goes down a little bit, and you see people going, well. Yeah, like you said, it's the culture that keeps people. And I think that's a scary part that I guess these changes don't account for, not just the velocity hit, but the culture actually aspect of it.
Yeah. You do have to have process for reasons, and there are business requirements that you're going to have to put into your SDLC, but there are also different phases in your journey. So, you're a startup, and then you transition to 20 engineers versus 100 engineers versus 200 engineers versus 1,000. You're going to have different process requirements along that journey. But one thing I have noticed is that, a lot of business folks, because they've worked at many different companies and companies just do this thing for reasons, they'll want to introduce this process. It may just not be the time to introduce that process. So not that the process is bad, Not that I'm saying no to this process. I'm actually just saying, no, it's not the right time for this process. Things like change management. You don't need as restrictive or the auditability potentially of change management really early on. You're just trying to move fast. Change management comes down the cycle. So you don't need to pre-optimize for all of the controls that, you typically have in that the business requires for reasons. There is a time and place for those controls. So sometimes it's not even I'm saying, no, we're not going to do it. It's no, we're just not there yet.
I like that. That's actually, that's a great way of looking at it because when people do join, I've noticed every org, every department that previous toolbox they bring with them, instantly everyone wants to open it up and go, I want to get kind of what I'm comfortable with and what I'm used to. And it's interesting that happens so often. I like different processes, different stages, and not saying no to something is very powerful. I was going to ask you a question about that. Actually, I'm going to start asking more leaders about this because I'm starting to realize that it's something that not everyone is born with. We all kind of learn at different phases. You mentioned something early on about, pushing back, escalating, feeling more empowered to say no. The question, I guess, and a little bit aside from the podcast, is at what point did you get comfortable? Like that concept of being empowered to say no, like when did that occur in your career? Because I think a lot of people who listen, if they want to move into management roles, I think that's a question that pops up a lot. And I think, we don't talk about it a lot, but I figured I'm going to get some perspectives of people to see how they started to learn to do that.
That's a really great question. I'm not saying no. I'm saying what you're asking, I can't give you what you're asking for, but here's how you can solve that thing, or here's a different approach. It's more like, pushing back a little bit on the request, but here are other ways that you can solve this same thing. So it's not necessarily that I'm saying no, it's like, here's other ways to solve this problem. But being able, I think this is a little bit of my kind of career maturity journey, is that by saying yes all the time, you're always reactionary. You can't get out of that space. And I think DevOps engineers tend to be really empathetic. And so we want to say yes to everything. We want to solve people's pain points. And it's just intuitive that when somebody asks for something, you're like, yeah, I can help you out with that. Oh yeah, I can help you out with that. But you're actually doing a disservice to your organization and your team by always saying yes, because you're not building resiliency outside of DevOps or, your business process. When you're always saying yes, you're stopping resiliency from being born. So you're actually doing your company or your team more of a service by having more self-service processes, or here's other ways that you can solve this thing. But always saying yes actually causes a bunch of negative things downstream in the long term. So that took me a long time to learn. I always thought saying yes, resulted in the best outcomes, but that's not true. Saying no actually results sometimes in a lot better outcomes, but that just takes trial and error to actually figure that out, because it's not intuitive.
That's awesome. I like that. Thank you for sharing. I haven't asked this a lot, but I did a recording recently that we kind of covered this, and I wrote down a note saying that I'd like to ask almost every guest about this, because I think it's very interesting. Everyone has different maturity level process around their career and when they get to this point, and we all do at some point, hopefully, and kind of realizing how we're all different is pretty cool. Kelsey, thank you for being on. Thank you for sharing. I was going to ask you, if you could ask a future guest to cover a topic or answer any question technology related, what would you like that to be?
Ooh, it's a hard question. I'm going to go with something like I feel like I spend a lot of time in, but struggle a bit with myself, that I could use some insight into. I'm a millennial. on the earlier end. And so I've kind of seen the journey of corporate world from, the journey into the cloud and, being on-prem and going to the cloud and, years of that kind of journey. And what I'm struggling with is like a lot of folks, new hires coming in, like the Gen Zs, like they operate in a very different way. A lot of times they push back in ways I wish I could have pushed back in, as part of my career. A lot of respect to them holding boundaries and things that I never felt empowered, till later on in my career. So I'd love some guidance from someone on, managing the different generations of software engineers and how you might have to have a different management style for different generations. That's been a hard thing for me, and I would love some insight into that.
That's a great one. I mean, especially you mentioned, you've seen the journey, you have some of the legacy, to the cloud. Whereas if you're coming into it and you only know the cloud, you're going to have a different perspective trying to solve different problems. So I like that one. I'd love to do an episode around that. What's a good way of somebody reaching out to you to talk about anything you mentioned on the podcast?
Sure. LinkedIn's the best way to get in contact with me. Find me on LinkedIn.
Okay. Well, we'll put that in the show notes for you. And if anyone does want to get in contact, they'll come your way. Thanks for being on. I love to thank you for sharing.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. That's it for this episode. We'll be back again, different guest, different topic. Until then, two things. One, Kelsey's topic's great. I'd love for somebody to come on and talk about managing different generations and the different styles that it may require, adjustments managers have to make. That would be a great topic. So if you can talk about it or someone reach out, let me know. Secondly, if you like the podcast, share it. That's how it grows. Throw a review on your favorite podcast listening app. That's how this thing gets bigger. And I appreciate everyone does. That's it for now. Thank you and goodbye.